Hi, everybody. My name is Magdalena Kaczmarska, and I am a second-year graduate student at the University of Arizona School of Dance. And today I will be giving you a lecture about postmodern women choreographers. And just to begin, I know that Erica has worked with you on some of the history of modern dance, so you kind of have an understanding of what we're talking about as far as the history of where what we're discussing fits into the historical timeline. So modern dance started right after World War I and right around the Great Depression. So we're talking mid to late 1920s into World War II, and then has been developing for up until now. So that's essentially 100 years of history. So you can imagine that what we've covered in class is really just some of the highlights, but there's a huge legacy of and diversity within the modern genre. Some of the people that we've covered, some of the great names in modern dance history, like Martha Graham, Jose Limon, Doris Humphreys, Dora Duncan, and Lester Horton. So those are some of the names that you're probably already familiar with. I think where you last finished off in lecture was learning about Merce Cunningham. So what was different about Merce Cunningham, and what Mr. Klauser and Erica have pointed out in lecture, is that he worked with involving the audience and giving the audience an opportunity to have more voice and in what experience they were receiving, right? So generally speaking, when you go into a theater setting, whether it's in a cinema, whether it's in a dramatic theater play, whether it's a musical, an opera, or a dance, generally there's a pretty set performance style, right? So there's a stage, and then there's seats, and the seats are separated from the stage, and there's an invisible wall that creates a kind of a safety space. So you can pretty much trust that the people who are going to be on the stage stay on the stage, and you stay in the seats. And whether you like what's happening on stage or on the screen or not, that's what it is, right? So Merce Cunningham started to play with the fact that maybe the audience can have a different interaction and and play a little bit with how an audience gets to perceive a dance. And he started to do that while working with his partner John Cage, who was a musician and a composer. And what they ended up developing was chance dance. Right, so the one way that he would do this would be the set would be designed by somebody else. The music would be designed by another person. The choreography would be designed by him. And a lot of times, even the choreography, he would try to take that out of his hands by using chance to figure out what the order, the structure, the number of the dancers would be. So those are important names to remember, and that's kind of where we're going to pick up today. So, Erica, if you can help me load up the screen. That's that one. And if I can have this bottom right here. Just to show it, yeah. Great. Okay. So we will begin actually picking up with Merce Cunningham. So around this time, so this would be 1960s, when Merce was working, he worked with John Cage and this another individual whose name was Robert Dunn, who led a composition class with Merce Cunningham and John Cage. Around that time, there were a handful of other dancers who were working with Merce in those studios. So Yvonne Rainer, who you will learn about in a moment, Steve Paxton, who really created Contact Improv, and a handful of other individuals. And they kind of were tired of having to perform in the traditional sense. So they didn't want to have to pay for studio fees. They didn't want rental fees for theater rental fees. They wanted to create a new style of dance and performance art. They wanted to play. So what they did is they approached the minister of a church in Greenwich Village in New York, which is called Judson Memorial Church, and they asked if they could use their space, and the minister agreed. And so Yvonne Rainer and these other individuals started meeting and rehearsing there, and this group was called Judson Dance Theater. And it was a collective of visual artists, musicians, composers, dancers, performance artists who got together and played and created new movement, new ways of performing. And they were active in this church. And they were really active maybe from 1962 to 1965, a really small window. But really what they started is what has now become known as postmodern dance. And the styles and the structures that they used and the ideas that they created have really since become staples in choreography and in the dance world today. And so today we'll kind of learn a little bit about some of the women who were working in that genre. So this is a picture of what Judson Church looks like. So in 1978, a New York-based organization called Movement Research actually took over the legacy of what Judson Dance Theater did, and they are still operational today. They open up the floor to up-and-coming New York artists, as well as people who are in midlife, mid-career, and as well as very established and international artists. And every week they have a informal performance at Judson Church in the style of and in the history of what the Judson Dance Theater did. So what you see here, this is actually Shen Wei Dance Arts. It's a Chinese choreographer. They're actually very famous. They just came to U of A in the fall and performed. But you can see here they're performing in Judson Church, and you can see that it's a church. There's a congregation that still meets, and then when the congregation is not meeting and they have a performance, they clear the chairs out and people sit on the sidelines, and the inside space is a dance floor. So this is kind of to give you an idea of what these people were working with. We'll begin with Yvonne Rainer. So Yvonne Rainer is actually one of the founding members of Judson Dance Theater. She, along with Steve Paxton and Robert Dunn and a handful of other people, were the people who actually started the theater. What Yvonne Rainer did was to really start to play with structuring and creating dances. So some of the elements that she would play with would be repetition, patterning, coming up with tasks, creating some sort of a game through which she would create movement. And a lot of her interest came from trying to strip away all of these stylized mannerisms that a lot of the other dance genres had adopted. So whether it's ballet or even Martha Graham, a lot of so say if we were to reach an arm, in a ballet arm, you would incorporate some sort of other stylization into it. Yvonne was interested in just isolating the movement of an arm and looking at the body as a source of movement, just from ordinary movement. So some of these things that she did have since been used by choreographers. Another thing that she would do would be incorporating sounds and things that people aren't used to. So a lot of times you don't hear dancers making sounds and voices on stage. And so she would experiment with wailing and shrieking and squeaking and all sorts of sounds in her performances. This is a picture of Yvonne when she was younger. She and her company are rehearsing a piece called Parts of Some Sextets from 1965. It was created for 10 people and 12 mattresses. And a lot of her work initially was playing with repetition. But one of the pieces that you will see, and when you are looking at this on your own, you can use this YouTube link to take a look at it. It's a 10-minute piece. You really only need to watch maybe the first minute and a half. But what you'll see in this particular dance, Yvonne really wanted to, she noticed that she had been using repetition a lot. So she challenged herself to create a 10-minute dance where there was absolutely no repetition. Every movement was unique. And there was no repetition within the entire 10 minutes. She also wanted to challenge herself to never engage with the audience. So when you watch this film, you can see each of the movements is stripped of any stylization. None of it repeats, and each one feeds into the next. So before we move on, and to just kind of give you an idea, because this is really where postmodern dance starts, this is what Yvonne Rainer talked about with regards to her dances. And this is actually something that she wrote in response to that dance about 10 people and 12 mattresses. So she said, "No to spectacle, no to virtuosity, no to transformations and magic and make-believe, no to the glamour and transcendency of the star image, no to the heroic, no to the anti-heroic, no to trash imagery, no to involvement of performer or spectator, no to style, no to camp, no to seduction of spectator by the wiles of the performer, no to eccentricity, no to moving or being moved." So that's Yvonne Rainer in a nutshell. So following off of that, we'll move on to Trisha Brown. So Trisha was actually approached by Yvonne Rainer and invited to join Justin Dance Theater. And she, whereas Yvonne Rainer really started these ideas of repetition and kind of moving away from traditional stylized dance, Trisha Brown took it a step further. So not only did she use a lot of repetition, use the body as a source of movement, but she also was very interested in looking for spaces outside of the theater to perform. So whether it be performing on the street or whether it's starting to find a space that informs a performance, she started to do this. And today this is called site-specific dance. And site-specific work is a huge subgenre of postmodern dance. And we will talk about somebody else later on, but Trisha Brown can really be seen as starting this kind of movement. This first picture that you have here, this is a dance similarly to Yvonne Rainer. Trisha Brown chose to play with the presentational nature of a lot of dances like ballet, where everything is done facing the audience, incorporating and acting with and performing to the audience with the face and the front of the body. Trisha Brown performed this piece called "If You Can't See Me," where she performed the entire piece facing the back, so you never got to see her front. And the interesting thing about this is that one of the things that Trisha Brown did was to look at things that we take for granted and find different ways of manipulating them or presenting them where the audience gets to have a new experience and appreciation of it. So a lot of times we, at least in our culture, are conditioned when we speak to engage with who we're speaking to with our face. So we'll make eye contact, we'll look at somebody, we gesticulate with our hands, and as individuals, when we respond to that, that's where we look, right? So when we watch performances, unless we're conditioned to know movement, then in that case we might look at feet or hands. Generally speaking, people will look at the upper body and the face, right? So when you take the face away, in this case, and perform facing the back, all of a sudden you get to appreciate how much movement and vocabulary and communication can happen just with the back and the torso and the arms. because you've taken away this thing that occupies so much of our attention, which is the face. The dances that you will see right now, if you have a chance to take a look at them, and please see them in order. So this dance is called Man Walking Down the Side of a Building. This is a reenactment of the dance, which was originally done in 1970. And when you watch it, it's a man who's propelled down the side of a building, and he's at 90 degrees perpendicular to the wall, and he walks down. And it doesn't look like much. He looks like it's a breeze for him. It seems very easy for him. But watch this first and see what you think. What do you notice? What do you see? And then go ahead and watch the second dance. This is Elizabeth Streb, who is approached by Trisha Brown and asked to perform this at the Whitney in 2008 or so, when the Whitney, it's a museum in New York, was doing a whole series of movement performances, and a lot of it was Trisha Brown. So Elizabeth Streb was invited to do this dance down the side of the Whitney. And she is a postmodern choreographer, but contemporary. She's active now. She's I think she calls herself a high action choreographer. And a lot of her work, her company work, is throwing people across stage, doing all sorts of daredevil stuff. So she's a very, very physically active individual. And as you watch this video, notice how she's struggling with this movement. So maybe it gives you an appreciation of how challenging this dance actually is. And also listen to what she says about Trisha Brown and the approach that she used to this dance, and what she says about why this dance is important. She talks a lot about deconstructing walking. Again, walking after, most of us learn to walk when we're 2 or 3. We're toddlers. And after that, we really don't think about it. It's something we take for granted. And what Elizabeth Streb points out, by doing this, by creating this dance, Trisha really took something that we take for granted and deconstructed it. And through that, helped us have a new appreciation of something that really is very mundane, right? So it's a way of literally turning things on their sides for us, and maybe thinking about them in a new way. So just kind of recapping Trisha Brown, we can think about that she was continuing to deconstruct simple human movement and helping us see them in a new way. And she also really introduced site-specific work, taking performance into the streets or into a different space. The next person that we will learn about is Lucinda Childs. So Lucinda Childs, again, studied in New York. She was also invited to Judson Dance Theater. And when she first began working with them, she really was more interested in expressionistic work, doing almost performance art, and really playing with different ways to present material to the audience. A lot of what, well, we'll talk about that in a second. For now, I'd like for us to fast forward later into her career, which is something that she is really remembered for now. Lucinda Childs actually left New York, went to France, and created the work that we'll be learning about now there, and has then brought it back to the United States. This is her. She's actually performing the dance that you will see in a second. And what Lucinda Childs did in her later years is she would take a movement phrase that was really very simple. Because of that, she has been called a minimalist choreographer. And I'd like for you to remember that, because this dance that you're about to see, and we'll fast forward to the next slide, I'll come back to this score in a second. So the dance that you will see is called Dream, and this is a restaging of the work. So I would only watch maybe the first 1.5 to 2 minutes of this clip. But this is a piece that Lucinda Childs did with composer Philip Glass and visual artist Sol LeWitt. And you can listen to them talk about it. But really what both Philip Glass and Lucinda Childs are minimalist creators. So the music of the composer Philip Glass is very minimal. There's a phrase that begins and then gets deconstructed a little bit, or it gets changed and varied slightly. And over the course of the music, it will change and maybe come back. And you can see that Lucinda Childs is also follows that a numerical, mathematical creation of Philip Glass very closely. And then she mirrors it, and then she goes in and out of that phase and then comes back. So you can see that in the dance. And she talks about that. So what she did, and you can see here in the score, is she would take a movement phrase and set it on 2 dancers or 3 dancers and then manipulate it. So to kind of explain this a little bit, I think most of you will probably know what a musical score is, right? Those of you who've played music or even know just very basic music theory, we all know that the way that musicians learn music traditionally is that they will have a score. So it's essentially a map for musicians to figure out how to play a piece. So there's lines, and there's usually different rules for each of the instruments that are in the piece. And then there's symbols on the lines that represent dynamics, how soft or loud something is, how long something is, whether it's sustained or sharp. All of the symbols mean something. And around this time, musicians were actually saying, well, maybe I don't want to use this traditional style of presenting my music anymore. Maybe I'm going to take something like this and say, okay, well, this is my score, right? So there's these yellow lines, they're vertical, there's these white lines that are vertical, and then there's some blocks. And here, musicians, this is what I want you to use to create music, right? And so dancers were also looking at that and saying, okay, well, I'm going to do the same thing. And they would take a score and say, this picture is a score for you, and I want you dancers to figure out, what these things mean. Whether this is the organization of the stage, whether these are the dynamics, each of these things can symbolize different things. So what you see on the screen right now is a dance that Lucinda Childs did. It's called Melody Excerpt. It's for 4 dancers. And each of the little marks, each color is a different dancer, and each of the marks represents a different phrase that was manipulated, and then the direction in which it was manipulated. So that's kind of something to remember about Lucinda Childs, that this was something that she really created. The other dance that you will see, and I'd like for you to watch this after you've watched Dream. This is from Lucinda Childs' earlier career. It's a piece called Carnation. It's more of her performance art. But when you watch this dance, really think about what you see and listen to what Yvonne Rainer says about the dance, where really what Lucinda was playing with was this idea that dance doesn't have to be beautiful. And what does beautiful really mean? So she played with presenting herself as an attractive, very put together, almost elegant woman, doing these kind of ludicrous and absurd things and transforming her face into a painting, essentially. And so really what she was playing with was with these ideas of what is ugly, what is beautiful, and maybe asking us to question how we define those things for ourselves. So this kind of wraps up what the postmodern art scene looked like in New York in the beginning of the 60s and the 70s. Each of these individuals kind of encompasses some of the main tenets of postmodern dance and what was happening in New York. So now I'm going to give you an example of what was happening abroad, outside of the United States, because as you may remember, modern dance actually started not only in the United States, but simultaneously in Europe, in Germany specifically. So postmodern dance also has a pretty strong heritage and legacy outside of the United States. So the first person that we'll learn about, or actually they're a pair, are Aiko and Koma. They're a Japanese group. Aiko is the woman, and Takahashi Koma is the man. And they have been working since 1972. And these are them. Aiko is the woman, and Koma, Takashi is the man. And they were inspired by the postmodern dance genre called Buto. And Buto started in Japan right after World War II and the aftermath of Hiroshima. and people really didn't know how to respond to the atrocities of that. So this dance genre kind of came out of that horror of what happened. And Butoh is, if you ever watch it, it's the individuals are usually nude, very almost skeletal, and they paint their bodies in white. And a lot of the movement happens also on the face, so they will represent shock and horror and like silent screaming on their face. A lot of the movement is very, very slow, coupled, like glacial almost, and then coupled with very quick, sharp dynamics. Usually it's very stark, and they will use some natural props like dirt or twigs as props. So Aiko and Koma incorporated some of this, as well as some kabuki Japanese theater, to inform some of their movement style. What they ended up creating is a movement style called Delicious Movement, which is their own movement that's kind of based off of Butoh. It has some similarities in the sense that they also have very glacial movement that's so slow that you barely notice the change unless you watch it for a long period of time. And then coupled with very strong dynamics. What Aiko and Koma do, though, is that they really picked up on the idea that kind of what Trisha Brown was doing, of doing site-specific work. What they do differently is that they will create work specifically on the site that is important to them. So they'll pick a space, and then they will create the work designed within that space. They will work with the architecture of that space to create their work, and they'll play with the space while they're performing. And a lot of their work is also very much political activism or some sort of an activism. They'll pick an issue that's important and relevant, and they will create work around it. So right after 9/11, for instance, they picked a park in New York, and they created a series of work that they performed in the park. They did a series that they created in rivers and bodies of water in the United States. They recently did a work on hunger that was featured in some museums. So this is just something that they do. What we will be looking today in the video is Aiko. So Aiko herself did a whole series of works where she kept the same costume and the same props, and then she took a series of movements to different non-specific places. So public spaces like libraries and train stations and warehouses, and she would perform within those spaces. And you'll see in this video, and you can watch it, there's a Vimeo link to it. You can watch 4 or 5 of these excerpts. You can kind of get an idea of what she's doing. And what's interesting about this particular work is that all of the people who become audience members unwillingly. So they're walking through a space that for them is normal, and now it's suddenly become a performance space. And so you can watch these people and see how they respond. How they respond to her, whether they choose to ignore her or interact with her, and end up seeing how each one of those performances ends up becoming unique because of the individuals that come there. So that's kind of something that's special about a site-specific work. The next person that we'll move on to is Pina Bausch. And Pina is a very important person to know. She's a huge name in postmodern work. She kind of, if you had studied, I'm not sure if you covered Kurt Jooss, but he was a German choreographer who was working in Germany right before World War II. So right around the rise of the fascist party in Germany. And he created a lot of work that was a political response and a political speech through movement. And what he did was called dance theater. And Pina Bausch studied with him and carried that legacy into the 20th century, later decades in the 20th century. But she took that and made it her own. What was unique about her work is that she was very driven by emotions and the human experience, and she was very interested in finding different ways to represent the human experience, but not just superficial or maybe the pretty things that we're used to seeing in theater, but really the brutality as well as the beauty of humanity. And some of the characteristics of her work is that she would have senior citizens performing on stage with youth and her company members. She also has very elaborate and very interesting sets. So here on this slide, you can see one of her recent pieces. It's called The Window Washer. It's about Chinese immigrants in Germany. And the entire set is covered with just tons and tons of red silk flowers. She did a rendition of The Rite of Spring, which you may recall from your ballet lecture, in which the entire stage was covered in dirt. She did another set with flowers and tulips. She did another set where dancers threw water on each other on stage. So she plays a lot with these very human experiences, but also creating a really beautiful image on stage. She thinks about the entire piece and experience of the audience. The piece that you will be watching, and this is Pina here. This is the film that I've posted for you is an excerpt from later on in this dance. It's called Café Müller. The performance that she made was in 1978, and this is her performing it. The dance was in response to World War II, and the set takes place in a cafe, and it's filled with cafe chairs. And Pina performed the entire dance with her eyes closed, and another dancer would come in and move the chairs out of her way. The dance that you will see is an excerpt, and it's a trio. And some of the things I'd like for you to think about when you watch this is what emotional response do you have to this, and why? What did the dancers do that incited that response in you? And some of the things to think about is some of the tenets of postmodern dance. So whether it's repetition, where did the movement come from? Is it something that's very stylized, or is it a movement that you recognize? Is it human? And then also think about, what do you hear? Do you hear music, or do you hear something else? And how does that contribute to your experience? And also another thing to note, if you have chance and you're interested in looking at something else, Pina Bausch passed away in 2009, and around that time there was a film that was made about her and her company, and it's called Pina, and it used to be on Netflix, but whether you rent it or purchase it or just watch it on Netflix, it is absolutely beautiful cinematography and a great example of her work. And I think you'll really enjoy it if you have a chance to watch it. And so we'll finish off the presentation today with a more recent choreographer. Her name is Anne-Therese de Keersmaeker, and she's Belgian. She actually came to the United States and studied, but came back to Germany and created the work. She created the work Phase, or Phase, which we will be watching. And something that's important about her is that she started and created or established the company, the school Parts in Belgium, which is really the epitome of contemporary dance in the world right now, one of the most prestigious schools. And she runs that following in the tenets that she has adopted for her company. She also created a company called Rosas, and she made a dance for them called Rosas Dance Rosas. And if you have a chance, I posted a link to one of the excerpts of that dance that was made for film, which this is something that Anne-Therese de Keersmaeker did, which is actually important because this trend of creating dance for film in recent years has become very popular and is really a new genre in postmodern dance. And she really is one of the first people to play with that. So this is a film in which she adapted her choreography, which had been performed on stage, to film. And you can actually, if you Google this on YouTube, you can find the entire dance there, and I really encourage you to watch it. But what we will be focusing on in class today is her dance called Phase, or Phase. This is on Anne-Therese de Keersmaeker, just so you can put a face to the name. And then the dance Phase was made in 1982, and it's If you backtrack and you think about Lucinda Childs was a minimalist choreographer, right? And she worked with Philip Glass, who was a composer. Anna Teresa, the Charismaker, worked with another minimalist composer whose name is Steve Reich, also a very famous individual. And when you watch this dance, notice how, similarly to Lucinda, Anna Teresa, the Charismaker, really picks one or two very simple movements that are done in repetition. And if you watch the two dancers, they are moving in absolute unison. And aside from, a little bit later in the dance, you'll notice that there's a change. Watch about 2.5 minutes of this and look and see what you notice. And also notice how it's presented. Look at the screen behind them, at the projection of their shadows, and notice what you see as they go through the dance. And what happens a little bit later when the two dancers switch temporarily, and notice what's happening with the music as well as with the dancers. So just to wrap up the presentation, I guess you can see this is just really an overview of postmodern dance, but hopefully some of the things that you can note is some of the changes that these postmodern dancers did to what modern dance had done to that point and what ballet had done up to that point. So playing with what the audience experiences with the performance aspect of dance. So thinking about maybe not performing things on stage, finding different spaces to perform, different ways of making dances, taking movement from the human form and from non-stylized movement, playing and creating dances by structuring games and patterns and repetition and all sorts of different tricks that you can do to make dances, and playing with emotions or lack of emotions, playing with minimalism and coordinating dance with music, using music, dance, and visual art together to create really elaborate sets. All of these, and also playing with film. So all of these things are tenets of postmodern dance that I hope you will continue to explore on your own. And there is a prompt that Erica will post for you to discuss.
To the assignments.
That will be posted in the assignments. Okay, thank you. It wasn't too bad. It was like 20 minutes.
We're still on. Okay, thanks dancers, and again, thanks to Magda for coming in. And just again, please look under the assignments tab under the guest modern lecture, and there will be the PowerPoint with the prompt at the end, so you can look at the videos through that, and it will be due March 21st. Have a great spring break, and I'll see you March 21st.